Shabbat Shalom and Chanukah Sameach. At the end of the story of the Exodus, and yes, I know it's Hanukkah, but bear with me. At the end of the story of the Exodus, as we have crossed through the parted sea, where are our enemies? Underwater, right? They have been drowned as the sea caved back in over them and washing Pharaoh and all of his host away, so that we are now free and clear from Egyptian slavery. At the end of the story of Purim, at the end of Megillat Esther, where are our enemies? Dead, right? Haman is hanging or impaled, depending upon your translation, along with his co-conspirators in Shushan. And across the Persian Empire, there are countless people who attempted to raid the Jewish homes that found that the Jews were able to defend themselves thanks to royal decree, and they are now dead. At the end of the story of Hanukkah, where are our enemies? Doing just fine, thank you very much. The Seleucid Empire, right, the empire of Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who was the main baddie, the Seleucid Empire was more or less doing fine. Oh no, we lost Judea. We lost that postage stamp-sized piece of territory there along the eastern Mediterranean shore. Whatever will we do? It was not a catastrophe for them. It was impressive that we were able to push them back long enough to be able to retake Jerusalem and rededicate the temple. But even at that point, at the end of the story of Hanukkah, as most people celebrate it, the war wasn't done. The war wasn't close to being done. The war, with hot and cold spells back and forth, would go on for another 20 years before the Seleucid Empire would begrudgingly acknowledge some form of independence for that tiny little rump of a kingdom called Judea. And do not imagine that this was the greater Israel map that you might have. This was literally Jerusalem, its environs, and a little bit of extra territory. It wouldn't even come close to filling the map of current-day Israel with or without the West Bank or other territories. And that is what we are celebrating. But where were our real enemies at the end of Hanukkah? Because what was the War of Hanukkah about? Was it about reclaiming that territory of Jerusalem and its, few square miles around it? Was that why we were fighting during the battles of the Maccabees? No, because we had not had political independence for a few hundred years at this point. And that had never bothered us before. Well, maybe a little bit, as we saw there were some hints of possibly wanting to get back our monarchy during the Haftarah, which is set during the Persian period, which is immediately following the Babylonian. But when the Persians took over from the Babylonians and returned us to our homeland, they did not hand us the keys to the car and say, great, you're on your own now. They said, great, you're able to rebuild your temple, be in control of your local affairs, but you are still a subject of the Persian Empire. This is why the story of Purim was so powerful, because we were still a subject of the Persian Empire. And when Alexander the Great came along and he knocked over the Persian Empire, he didn't tell us, oh great, you're free now. He said, you work for me now. I'm the new CEO. But you're the local branch, and I'll let you keep doing what you're doing. But from now on, you send your receipts to Macedon. Well, you never made it back to Macedon, but you get the point. And we'll be cool with that. And when the Seleucid Empire came as one of the successor states and eventually kicked the Ptolemies out and took the land back, took the land for themselves, they started off by saying the same. You work for us now. You get to do local affairs, but we're in charge. All of those hundreds of years, all of those different empires and different leaders, we basically said, deal. Okay. Yeah, we know we're not going to beat Persia. We know we're not going to beat Alexander the Great. We know we're not going to beat the Ptolemies, and we're not going to beat the Seleucids. And if all you want us to do is send you the tax revenue on time and not cause trouble, We can do that, even if it means we are but a tributary to your empire. So what was the actual war about if it wasn't for our independence and having the right to stick our own coins for this tiny piece of land? Freedom of faith. When Antiochus backed Jews who wanted to institute Hellenism, remember it was a civil war at first, who wanted to institute Hellenism, when Antiochus said, not only are they right, but everybody better do the same, we said, whoa. That wasn't the terms of your hostile takeover, right? And it wasn't the terms of Alexander, it wasn't the terms of Persians. You took us over and we were okay with that, but we get to still be us. I am changing the terms of the agreement, said Antiochus. From now on, you get to be like us. You can still be Judeans, but you are no longer allowed to be Jews. You are no longer allowed to have Judaism as your central form of worship and expression. And we said, yeah, that's not going to work for us. And thus the Maccabee Wars began and went on for decades until we were finally able to secure our borders, because without them we had no right under the empire at the time to have our independence. So we won, right? It all depends on when you roll the credits. It all depends on when you try to put up the phrase, the end. At the end of the final wars, at the end of the final battles, when we had our little rump of a state and we were able to mint our own coins and call ourselves free and get on with the business of being Jews without constantly worried about immediate war, we only had to worry about potential war like every other state, that's not a bad place to roll the credits and to say they lived happily for a bit. But the actual war was still going on. Because the war that had begun, the war that had been forced upon us, was a war of identity, a war of whether we would still be Jews or whether we would adopt and become Hellenists like the rest of the Mediterranean basin. And you know what? That side almost won. It didn't win during the story of the Maccabees, but by the time we get to the end of the Second Temple period, it was a touch-and-go thing. Right? Now, how did the Second Temple end? Who destroyed that one? The Romans. Thank you very much. Got to make sure you guys get your history lesson. Right? The Romans destroyed the Second Temple. And why were the Romans in our country? I mean, why were they in every country? But more specifically, why and how did they end up in the land of Judea? Invitation only. We invited them. Or more specifically, our Hellenized kings, the great-grandchildren of the Maccabees, invited the Romans in to settle their dispute over who would be the successor to the throne. And when Rome came in to handle that argument, they set up shop. But look at how the people had become. Antigonus, Aristobulus, Alexandra, right? Alexander the Great, but the feminine form. These are the leaders of our people during that time period. This is not Matiyahu, right? This is not Yochanan. Who are these people? They are thoroughly Hellenized people living in Judea, who have a token allegiance to Torah, who have a token acknowledgement of Adonai, but it is more a cultural affectation than it is a deep and abiding faith within them. They have become what we would now call probably a secularized and internationalized version of our former selves. And that almost won the day. In fact, if it had not been for Roman oppression and Roman destruction, you could make a very good argument that we would have ended up becoming so thoroughly Hellenized and with this Greek Mediterranean culture that we would have simply drifted into the pages of history and become another nation that was absorbed, transformed, and discarded by the cycles of time. The war was almost lost, even after we had won. And truth be told, that war continues. The war is always ongoing. Not the war with the spears and the elephants and all the things that make for great TV specials. I mean the actual war of ideas, of who are we? Who are we? And are we willing to actually struggle to maintain who we are, even when that struggle is not charging after an elephant, even when that struggle is not piloting a fighter, but when that struggle is choosing how to live my life on a day-to-day basis that reflects the actual teachings of our traditions and ways in a way that will enrich myself and the world around me, despite also simultaneously inconveniencing me, because I end up having to do things that maybe I wouldn't have necessarily wanted to do, and not doing things that perhaps I would have liked to have done. If we are willing to fight that war on a day-to-day basis, then we continue to go on battle after battle, day after day, to be able to reap the benefits of being part of this tradition of Judaism. And if we do not, if we wave the white flag and say, what's the point? Why bother? Who cares? It's all the same. Let's just, pack it in. We are gone like that. That is the threat and the war that we continue to wage. And it is one that despite all of the victories we have had on the battlefields and all of the victories we have had throughout history, is never going to be finished. We can never lay down our arms in the struggle for our identity and our culture and our ideas. We can never cease that struggle. That does not mean that we have to be antagonistic. It doesn't mean that we have to be aggressive. It doesn't mean that we have to be offensive, God forbid. But it does mean that we need to continually reinforce and understand that the ideas, the wisdom, the knowledge, the teachings of our traditions, and the shape of our lives that is given by those paths of action, those are things that need to be preserved, not merely in our mind and not merely in our books, but in our hearts and in our lives. That is the ultimate struggle. And that is one that is never going to get a holiday. And it is never going to get a TV special. But it is the only one that is truly worth fighting. Because what we do on the battlefield is immaterial if what we do in our private life hands the trophy of victory to those who tried to destroy us so long ago. Shabbat Shalom and Chanukah Sameach.